Term limits. What are they? Who do they affect? And what's the history behind them? Bye-bye birdie, an informative presentation. So what are term limits? Term limits is basically the idea that members of Congress shouldn't have unlimited time to serve, that there should be some sort of restriction to incumbents running for a re-election so they cannot serve indefinitely. Members of the government currently, President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, and even Minority Leader McConnell have spent half of their life in elected office. So when we look at the history of term limits from a historical sense, we bring ourselves to our founding father, our nation's first president, George Washington. He was a proud supporter of the two-term precedent at the federal level for the presidency. In the name of democracy, almost 2 centuries later, the 22nd Amendment, introduced in 1947, later ratified in 1951, basically set the 2 4-year term in law. After President Franklin Delano Roosevelt served 3 full terms, and into his 4th term dying within 3 months. President Reagan, President Clinton, when we speak about opponents of the 22nd Amendment itself and the 2-term precedent, their names come in history, thinking that presidents should be able to serve as much time as they want. Term limits have long been supported by many groups, activist groups out in the country, and the ultimate deciders are the U.S. Congress. So when we look at it from a sense of why term limits, supporters of term limits have found indefinite service undemocratic and corrupt, we look at facts such as the fact that incumbents running for re-election receive $1 million for existing, nearly unlimited PAC money from lobbyists and special interests and other donors. The average re-election rate for an incumbent running for office is well over 90%, and that number has stayed true since the 1990s. And over time, we see that in the U.S. Congress at the federal level and at the state level, and the state legislators, state representatives, and state senators built these sort of relationships with federal congressmen and women. These friendships sometimes can raise questions. What is going on? When it comes to the redrawing of districts every 10 years and the redistricting process, we can see that these relationships and these friendships that federal members of Congress and the state legislators build can impact on how lines will be drawn. So in 1990, author Hendrik Hertzberg argued for a 12-year limit, for 2 terms in the U.S. House and 2 6-year terms in the United States Senate, arguing that, well, if there was a 12-term limit for both bodies, that incumbents, special interest and lobbying money from donors and the such, allows politicians political favors. This should be reformed. People affected are the people themselves, the constituents of federal politicians. When we see no change in the slate of the country because of a lack of progress, a lack of congressional integrity due to the fact service is indefinite. When we look at a historical sense too, for the argument of term limits, we bring ourselves back to the 1920s and 30s, the political mobs in Philadelphia and Chicago, run by the Republican Party at the time, were overthrown by working Democrats in the wake of the Depression. Author Carol Nakanoff points to an amendment that Arkansas voters voted on in 1992, Amendment 73, in which 60% of Arkansas voters supported. Amendment 73 stated the support of term limits on the federal and state level, and even the United States Supreme Court. This was passed, like previously stated, with 60% of support from Arkansas voters. After the passage of this bill, the U.S. Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. So supporters of term limits bring up the advantages that incumbents have with regards to cash, name recognition, the influence they have on how their districts are redrawn due to relationships with members of the state legislature, and the fact that the incumbent re-election rate is 90%. These people do not have to worry, is the argument, about their re-elections. And support is bipartisan, with the lowest support group coming from the Democratic Party. But independents and Republicans almost in the 80s together. Proponents state that congressional integrity and productivity would rise if term limits were implemented, fresh faces being in the Congress. So with the election of new congressmen and women to our Congress every 2 years, fresh faces would eliminate the possibility of quid pro quo. Proponents bring up the local level, how these provisions have been effective, how local productivity in the local government has been affected. If we bring these issues to the federal level, perhaps productivity would increase. So, when we think of the idea of term limits and how to get there, we have to vote. If the passage of amendments in support of term limits is enacted, then the passage of that will impact the federal level. Thank you.